The American people have always been obsessed with conspiracy theories.
Who actually fired the shots that killed Kennedy? Was there a conspiracy?
We're now learning Area 51, America's capital city for UFO sightings and the stuff of Hollywood science fiction, is apparently real.
Much as you try to bury it, the truth is out there.
What used to be regulated to the back corners and chat rooms of our society is starting to make its way into the mainstream, even to the White House.
It's no overstatement to say that Donald Trump's path to the White House began with a single conspiracy theory, that being that Barack Obama wasn't an American, the so-called birther conspiracy.
Those Trump supporters you see waving around the letter Q printed on signs and on their T-shirts are followers of Q, a anonymous poster on the message boards 4chan and 8chan. Q claims to be sharing insider government secrets with the masses.
And things are actually becoming dangerous.
Fake news, real gunfire. A North Carolina man arrested in a D.C. pizza shop after brandishing a gun, telling police he was there to investigate a conspiracy theory called Pizzagate.
There are measles outbreaks happening in Washington State and Oregon right now that have parents furious at people who refuse to vaccinate their kids. They say the anti-vaxxers are putting their kids' lives at risk. Why doesn't this conspiracy theory die?
So what makes one person believe in conspiracy theories while another just laughs it off?
What we see when we see people engaged in conspiracy theories is that they're drawing on their own intuitions to make sense of the world.
That's University of Chicago political science professor Eric Oliver. He's been studying conspiracy theories and the people who believe in them for a decade. What he's discovered has led to a theory that could explain not only why people are drawn to conspiracy theories, but why our increasingly polarized country seems to be tearing itself apart.
In some ways, people who exhibit extreme behaviors or extreme tendencies can be illustrative for us when we're trying to figure out how ordinary people make sense of the world.
From the University of Chicago, this is Big Brains, a podcast about the stories behind the pivotal research and pioneering breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. On this episode, Eric Oliver, Conspiracy Theories and Our Divided Country. I'm your host, Paul Rand.
I first got interested in conspiracy theories when I was a long-haired graduate student walking down Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, California. As some people may know, Berkeley is filled with a lot of interesting characters who are typically shouting at other people. And this one guy comes up to me and goes, "Hey man, you gotta look at this." The entire page was filled in very small script with his conspiracy theory about Queen Elizabeth and the Trilateral Commission and aliens. And at first I thought, oh, this guy's just another Berkeley crazy. But then I stopped and said, this is actually how he's perceiving the world. And I, as a political science student, was trying to think about how people conceive of politics. And it occurred to me that, wow, this guy has not only a different way of looking at the world, but he's so motivated, he wants to go out and spread it. And maybe there's more going on here than I may realize.
That interaction embedded itself in Oliver's memory. 10 years later, when he was a political science professor collecting survey data, that disheveled man and his conspiracy theory popped back into Oliver's head.
Well, I'd always been fascinated with conspiracy theories, and I'd always thought about this guy. And I actually had some room on a survey I was running. And it occurred to me, it's like, I've got a few survey questions. I'm curious how common these types of conspiracy theories are in the public at large. So I've been asking about conspiracy theories for about 12 years now in various surveys, and usually ask about 6 or 7 different conspiracy theories. Usually find about half of the public will agree with at least one of them. These range from what might seem really outlandish conspiracy theories, for example, the idea that vapor trails that follow jets are a campaign of secret government spraying, to ideas that, for example, the Food and Drug Administration is deliberately withholding natural cures for cancer from secret pressure from the pharmaceutical industry. And we usually get about 40% of Americans agreeing with that idea.
My goodness. Okay. And so those are some of the biggest ones that you hear out there right now?
Well, the most common ones would be something like that, the Food and Drug Administration one, the Obama birther conspiracy
still
theory.
Still out there?
Is still out there, still has some purchase. Not as common as when Barack Obama was president, but we still get about 18 to 20% of people, depending on the survey, will say that they agree with that. The 9/11 truth or conspiracy theory usually gets somewhere between 17 and 20% of people agreeing with that one as well.
Those are staggeringly high numbers, aren't they?
Yeah. And I think what got me interested in this was like, wow, what is really going on here? Why are so many people engaged in conspiracy theories? Why are so many people captivated by them? And what do they say about how we comprehend the world? And so when we started doing research, my co-author, Tom Wood, who was a graduate student here at the time at Chicago, we started doing surveys and we started looking around at what might be some things that correlate with belief in conspiracy theories. And the things that correlated most strongly with conspiracy theories were things like believing in supernatural or paranormal phenomena. And then that's what got us interested in magical thinking and realizing that, conspiracy theory seems to be similar to these things and that it's a form of magical thinking. And what magical thinking is when we basically make attributions to unobservable forces to try to explain some event. What's important about magical thinking is not simply that we just invoke the unobservable force, but that we also reject an alternative explanation that is based on something that's observable. What we came to realize, if looking at the research in anthropology and psychology on magical thinking and magical beliefs, was that this was a form of intuitive thinking.
Oliver and Wood used the data they collected to write Enchanted America. Their book shows that most people fall somewhere on a scale between being what they call an intuitionist or a rationalist. And it's this polarization that may explain why our country feels so at odds. Deeper than blue or red, liberal or conservative, we're actually divided by intuitionists and rationalists.
In the book, we talk about the difference between sort of rationalist and intuitionist parts of our minds. And the rational part of our mind is pretty transparent for the most part. We can see kind of clear logic and deduction and facts and claims. And rational thinking is notable for its ostensible transparency. Intuitions, on the other hand, kind of arise from the dark, murky, unconscious well of the soul. And, it's been something that poets and philosophers have struggled for centuries to try to understand. And so we were trying to think, well, how can we systematically understand how intuitions function? And we came up with basically two general ideas from literatures in anthropology and psychology on this. And one of which is that our intuitions are based in our emotions. And when we're feeling uncertainty about the world, it generates a lot of anxiety. That's an uncomfortable position for us. Any animal that lives in uncertainty is in danger. And so we spend a lot of our lives trying to reduce our uncertainty. We have a very strong natural inclinations. And so when we're facing something that's unclear, our intuitions are, let's find an answer as quickly as possible. Moreover, our intuitions also draw on our anxiety. So if we're feeling anxious, we look for an explanation that rationalizes that emotional experience. So with my son when he was 5, and children are great intuitionists. And my son one night was just convinced there was a monster in the closet. And after 20 minutes of looking in the closet and turning on the lights and trying to rationalize with him and telling him that there's no monster in the closet, no monster in the closet, and he finally turned and looked at me and he said, Dad, if there's no monster in the closet, then why am I afraid? And I was like, you got me there, pal. But that's basically how our intuitions work. We feel fear and we look for explanations that accord with our own feelings of anxiety. And in some ways, this is what conspiracy theories are out there doing. Since we're feeling afraid, there must be a monster in the closet. Then the second part of intuitions is that intuitions actually have a grammar to them. Our intuitions don't fly around willy-nilly, but they're bound by certain types of heuristics. And heuristics are these judgmental shortcuts that we make when trying to understand the world. For example, it's very common across religious beliefs to have what we would call a contagion heuristic. The idea that if you touch something that's taboo, you will be tainted and you need to be purified. Or that a relic that's holy has some sort of essence that itself, if you have contact with it, you'll get that transmitted as well. And that's how our brains work.
So if we have listeners that are listening to this episode of Big Brains and they're sitting there thinking, well, interesting. I wonder if I'm an intuitionist or a rationalist. Do you look at somebody and say, oh, I can tell who you are? Is there a mode of thinking that helps assess that?
So I can offer a few quick questions
Okay.
that are pretty good diagnostic. So we typically ask people in our surveys a couple of things and just tell us the first answer that comes to your mind and say, would you rather stab a photograph of your family 5 times with a sharp knife or stick your hand in a bowl of cockroaches?
That's a really crazy question.
It gets better. Would you rather...
Thank you, by the way, for not asking for an answer from me.
Okay, good. And I'll explain the logic behind it in a second. Would you rather sleep in laundered pajamas once worn by Charles Manson or pick a nickel off the ground and put it in your mouth?
Okay.
Would you rather spend the night in a dingy bus station or spend the night in a luxurious house where a family was once murdered? What we are doing with these questions, we are asking people to compare basically what are tangible costs to symbolic costs.
Okay.
So, for example, stabbing a photograph of our family. It's just a piece of paper,
Right.
a photograph. But for a lot of people, stabbing a photograph feels like we're violating or doing harm to a family member. It's like the equivalent of a voodoo doll.
Absolutely.
And so that's very emotionally costly for them. Similarly, sleeping in laundered pajamas once worn by Charles Manson, they're just cloth on our body, but the idea that Charles Manson had contact with them, it's a contagion heuristic. So these things end up being emotionally costly. And so people who are very sensitive to these types of heuristics are people who tend to then rely on their intuitions a lot more.
If you had to put a percentage on the U.S. electorate in terms of rationalists or intuitionists, how would you say that would break out today?
So like a lot of things, we tend to talk about the poles of the spectrum, and most people tend to be in the middle.
Got it.
So the same thing with ideology. If you look, most Americans are pretty moderate in their political preferences. They may describe themselves as conservative, but they actually have a lot of liberal policy viewpoints, and they ended up being kind of clustered in the middle. On our scales, most people are in the middle.
Got it.
And
70%?
I would say probably around 60% are in
Okay.
the middle. It's actually hard to find very strong rationalists. I would say intuitionists, probably among the remaining group, outnumber rationalists by about 2 to 1.
Once you begin to understand the separation of intuitionists and rationalists, you can start to see how it cuts to the core divisions in our country. That's coming up after the break.
Capitalism is the engine of prosperity.
Actually, it sows the seeds of its own demise.
Could both be right? I'm Kate Waldock from Georgetown University.
And I'm Luigi Zingales from the University of Chicago.
We're the hosts of Capitalism, a podcast about what's working in capitalism today.
And most importantly, what isn't.
We're going to share the sort of irreverent banter you'd hear between economists at a bar.
That is, if economists were to go to a bar.
Subscribe to Capitalism. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Oliver's theory about rationalists and intuitionists began to provide answers to some troubling questions about our society. Conundrums like evangelical voters supporting a candidate who seems completely out of line with their values, or progressive Berkeley parents who are also anti-vaxxers, start to make sense. Oliver says that this all came into sharp focus when he met a woman named Lucy Ryan.
So we were doing research into this book. We were doing both surveys and we were going out and talking to people in depth. And Lucy was a woman who lived in Texas. And at first glance, Lucy seemed like the kind of person who would be kind of a left-wing hippie. She's really into organic medicine. She was an elementary school teacher. She's very, very suspicious of banks and the financial industry. She wants to have more spending for the poor and for medical care. But then you talk to Lucy, and it turns out that she was a member of the Tea Party. She believed that Barack Obama faked his birth certificate. She was a big supporter of Ben Carson in the primaries and then switched her allegiance to Donald Trump, and she really, really hates Obamacare. And so when we were trying to talk to her and reconcile, well, how can she have on the one hand some of these types of beliefs and some of these contradictory beliefs, and we were working through with her and we were getting nowhere, and finally she turned and looked at us and she said, you know, the difference between you and me is that you believe in reason and I believe in the Bible. And that was a really prescient observation on her part, because what she was basically telling us was that she didn't see the world in the same way that we saw the world. Whereas we were looking for logical consistency and facts, for her, the world is a place of prophecy and symbol and myth. And these are the things that organize her worldview. And our reason-based way of understanding the world just doesn't hold a lot of meaning for her and relevance for her, in comparison to her idea, like, for example, that we're living in the end of times as foretold by biblical prophecy. And from that perspective, everything is ripe with symbolism. And Lucy's not alone in that. About 30% of Americans share that belief that we're living in the apocalypse.
It's a very, very high number.
Yeah.
And so that actually getting to some of these things starts driving. If 30% of the people have that belief, if they're looking at it through the same lens as Lucy, that starts providing some insight into some of the things that may be going on in our world and how this sense of polarization may be occurring.
Well, it is, because when we're talking about the difference between liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans, we're not simply just talking about differences in philosophy of government. What's been happening over the past 40 years in the United States is that conservatism has become increasingly an intuitionist movement. In other words, rational conservatives have been increasingly relegated to the wilderness, and mainstream conservatism is dominated by conspiratorial type of thinking, emotional type of thinking, these kind of, strong evocations of nationalism. I think what we've seen now in the past couple of years is really with Donald Trump, who is just the most stridently intuitionist political figure we've seen in our generation. The fact that he has come to dominate the Republican Party and dominate conservative politics, and rationalist conservatives really find themselves on the right now in the wilderness. Really just very, very much estranged from their own ideological brethren. And so one reason why liberals and conservatives have such a difficult time talking to each other, it's not simply that they have different policy preferences, it's that they have a different worldview oftentimes. One is evoking reason and policy and facts, and one is evoking symbol and metaphor and gut feeling. This worldview, this is actually an organizing force in politics in the same way that, say, party or ideology or even race are organizing forces in American politics. If you take a rationalist liberal and a rationalist conservative, they may disagree about sort of starting principles, but there's a common language they can use to discuss issues and debate issues amongst each other. However, if you're like me or anybody, you've had a conversation with someone who has a belief, a strong belief in something, say a conspiracy theory, or the idea that, Uncle Merle is coming back as a ghost. And, if you've ever had the experience where you just cannot talk to that person.
Right.
And there's just no basis of communication, and then you realize that you just have to change the subject.
And your idea is that that's actually happening more and more and more.
I think so. I think
so
our
too.
political discourse is getting more polarized along this dimension. It masks itself as an ideological polarization, but it's really not ideology. And the interesting thing is, if you look at contemporary presidential politics in the Republican Party, they don't really look like your father's Republican Party at all. And there's something much more populist, and that's that kind of populism that really speaks to this kind of intuitive sense of politics.
Okay, so if we went back 500 years, are we seeing other periods of history where there was such a discrepancy between the intuitionists and the rationalists?
Well, if you went back 500 years, you might say the difference between kind of the beginnings of science and the Enlightenment versus sort of the magical sources within the church in Western Europe. In the United States, I think we don't really have data going back. I think there's always been a very strong intuitionist element, but it hasn't necessarily been aligned with one political side or the other.
So that's newer.
I think that's newer. And, there's still a lot of intuitionism on the left. There are a lot of conspiracy theorists on the left. There's a lot of magical thinking on the left. It's not like the left is immune to this by any means. If you look at where the left begins in the United States, it's really during the progressive era at the beginning of the 20th century. This was an idea of having a more science-based orientation around politics, that we can solve society's problems by taking the tools of science and developing policies and thinking very rational and clearly about these as a way of sort of bettering democracy. So I think liberalism in the United States really begins kind of at the beginning of the 20th century and kind of crystallizes most clearly in the New Deal.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens.
Conservatism begins to really emerge in the late 1950s in response to the New Deal and crystallize in the 1960s. And you can think about someone like William F. Buckley.
Tonight, from Washington, D.C., firing line.
The role of the conservatives being one that needs to avoid gimmicky solutions to every ache in the body politic. Even so, I wonder whether the conservative community has been as creative as it ought to be.
And then what begins to happen is as the conservative coalition seeks to build and expand, and particularly in response to a lot of discomfort that a number of Americans were having towards the secularization and liberalization of American society, and particularly like Supreme Court decisions that, for example, banned prayer in school in the 1960s.
The Supreme Court has made a judgment. A good many people obviously will disagree with it. Others will agree with it. But I think that it is important for us, if we're going to maintain our constitutional principle, that we support Supreme Court decisions even when we may not agree with them.
There was a lot of apprehension around desegregation efforts in the South, where a lot of fundamentalist Christians were, and their fears of religious schools becoming integrated. That really politicized groups that were otherwise not that interested in politics. They were strongly intuitionists and not that interested in politics, and politicized them. And then, of course, with Roe v. Wade and abortion, pulled this group into politics.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions.
I think that to raise the dignity of woman and give her freedom of choice in this area is an extraordinary event. And I think that January 22nd, 1973 would be an historic day.
In this instance, the Supreme Court has withdrawn protection for the human rights of unborn children. I think that the judgment of the court will do a great deal to tear down the respect previously accorded human life in our culture.
And really politicized a set of religious beliefs and located them strongly within the conservative movement and began to orient the conservative movement around them.
So if this deep personal difference is what's dividing our country, what can we do about it? That's after the break. If you're listening to Big Brains, there's a good chance you consider yourself a lifelong learner. However, you may not know about the University of Chicago's Graham School and its focus on continuing liberal and professional studies. For more than a century, Graham has been a destination for lifelong learners. They offer courses online and in the classroom, bringing the transformative education UChicago is known for to students of all ages. To learn more about the courses, certificates, and degrees, visit graham.uchicago.edu. Each of us knows far too well what it looks like to see a rationalist and an intuitionist debate each other. We've all seen stories of two relatives who every Thanksgiving are going to spend dinner yelling at each other and seemingly getting nowhere. But when that argument scales up to a national level, Oliver says it threatens to do real harm to our society.
Well, I'm alarmed by this. And the reason I'm alarmed is that if you look at the history of modern democracy, it's a product of the Enlightenment. If you look at our country's founders, they were looking at early Enlightenment philosophers and saying, oh, how do we challenge the arbitrary power of kings and popes and whatnot? And we do this through reason and deduction. And James Madison writes very eloquently about this in the Federalist Papers, that the whole sense of our government is to actually thwart passions and intuitions and their role in politics, and the whole separation of powers and the structure of government, because they were very, very apprehensive about this as a destabilizing force for democracy. People who tend to rely heavily on their emotions and their intuitions to make sense of politics, they don't really have a sense of tolerance for opposition. They're not really very happy to extend civil liberties to people they disagree with. They're not really very interested in compromise. And particularly if there's you're trying to compromise across this worldview spectrum, that's going to be something that's very, very challenging to do when you have just very, very different sense of what reality is. That makes compromise even that much more difficult.
Right.
And that's what democratic politics is. It's about compromise. It's about respecting other people's rights. As long as this kind of intuitive force was evenly distributed across the political spectrum, its effects get muted somewhat. But when it begins to become concentrated on one end, that becomes a source of concern.
So is there some counter? If you went back and assuming the person that you ran into on the street as a young man in Berkeley was not mentally ill, but believed what he was actually telling you, and you actually wanted to change his mind, could you change his mind? And if so, how would you do it?
Well, I often get this question when I'm giving talks about this, and it's often from a liberal audience, and they want to know, how do we reach the other side? And everybody has their example of going home for Thanksgiving and talking to that family member whom they just can't communicate with, or somebody on the street. The difficulty of trying to reason with that person. And I oftentimes then go back and think about the example with my son and the monster in the closet. Okay. Reasoning and trying to reason away the monster in the closet did not make the monster go away. But listening to my son and acknowledging, the monster's there, that must be very scary for you. That was the opening for conversation. And that was the opening
acknowledging
for
it rather than trying to talk them out.
And, I think, if oftentimes we disparage conspiracy theorists, we see oftentimes the worst of conspiracy theorists. But, conspiracies do happen. There are bad actors in the world operating in secret. Governments, corporations, other entities occasionally do bad things or intentionally try to do bad things. Saying that, the world's a big, scary place, and there are bad things that happen, and there are things that we need to be aware of, and saying, okay, that's happening, and maybe this is very scary for you. That's, I think, one way of trying to bridge this gap is at least acknowledging that where people are when they're when they're drawing on conspiracy theories is that they're actually drawing on their emotions. And so we need to speak to their emotional side. How do we do this in a mass politics? I'm not so sure. On the more positive side, trying to think about, like what a Barack Obama does, is talk about hope, or even around Reagan, talking about kind of hope, a positive vision, a unified country, something that's more aspirational on that side.
Big Brains is a production of the U Chicago Podcast Network. If you like what you heard, please give us a review and a rating. Our show is hosted by Paul M. Rand and produced by me, Matt Hodep. Thanks for listening.